Hello, Glenn Greenwald. I'm delighted you've been able to join me today. Over the last couple of years or more, you've been a vital voice of reason and calm and careful analysis. So thank you very much.
Thank you for those nice words, and thank you as well for having me. I appreciate it.
To get right into it, Glenn, it seems to me that everything has gone up a gear. Everything's moving faster, maybe more than one gear. I feel when I get out of bed in the morning now, I barely know what to think might have happened overnight. I wonder if you feel the same sense of acceleration into events.
I do, and I actually think you can trace that back to 2016, which to me continues to be the beginning of this transformation of politics, not just in the United States or the UK, but the West generally, even the whole democratic world, where first the British people delivered a huge shock to Western liberalism by voting for Brexit, even though they were told not to. And then 3 months later, the even bigger shock that Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump and he became president of the United States. And out of that, I think, emerged this revealed and very profound and growing sense of anti-establishment fervor, where people in the West begin increasingly abandoning the trust and faith they had placed in our fundamental institutions that for years, maybe decades, had guaranteed a certain form of political stability and predictability in the West. And as those establishments began unraveling because they lost the faith and trust of the public, I think it's natural to see events develop in a lot more unpredictable way, a lot more accelerated of a way. And I think we're going to continue to see that for quite a while into the future.
It seems to me that nations traditionally, needed that trust. And that they needed the people, or most of the people, to trust the story that the state was telling them. And I do wonder if, in some way, the old power of storytelling has failed for too many people. And too many of us are now telling each other alternatives to the state narrative. The old power of state storytelling may be gone.
Yeah, I think the mythology of our state or our society is very important. It's what binds us tribalistically to one another. I think tribalism is a very important part of the human component. We need to feel like we have some cohesive connection to everybody who's part of our group or part of our side. And for a long time, we've identified as a nation state. The problem has been that there are ways to communicate and to reinforce that story, as you call it. And you can call it, a whole bunch of different similar words, but the idea is the same, which is an overarching narrative about how to understand what our group is. And the primary means in modern day life for communicating and reinforcing and feeding and augmenting that narrative, that nationalistic narrative, is through media outlets, the media outlets that have been dominant for some time. The problem is that those have been caught lying so often, delivering information that's unreliable, that's misleading, that's deceitful, that's false, or just otherwise transparently unworthy of confidence. And as people come to realize that these means of delivering information that we once trusted are themselves unreliable, the byproduct of that system is also going to be increasingly rejected, and people will turn elsewhere for alternatives. And technology, the internet specifically, a free internet in particular, is what has enabled people to do that more and more. And as we get information from different places or alternative places, that centralized narrative that I agree is crucial to a cohesive society, a stable society, is obviously being weakened, and I think quite justifiably so.
It seems to me that there's a degree of barefacedness out there on the part of governments, where they seem to be operating almost as though we know that we're being lied to, and they don't seem to care. So blatant is some of their behavior. But as you say, surely the increasingly desperate attempt to censor and to silence dissent and to take control of the internet and social media must be indicative that at some level the nation states still feel the need to have control of the narrative. And is that encouraging, that they're not quite in the all-powerful position where they aren't able to not care what most of us think?
I think it is. I think it's a cause for great optimism. I'm not entirely convinced, to be honest, that lying on the part of nation states in the West or their media partners or their other mechanisms for disseminating information has actually gotten worse say, over the past century. I think propaganda is a science that has been developed primarily in the 20th century and has gotten increasingly fortified. It's what, of course, George Orwell was mostly writing about in the mid-20th century and warning about the dangers of. I think what has happened is that, A, things like the Iraq War and the financial system collapse in 2008 and the series of reactions to both Brexit and Trump have become increasingly a little bit more glaring, a little bit less elegant than the lying was. But I think the far bigger change is that the internet and the advancement of technology has enabled a complete deconcentration of power. I mean, even 15 years ago, if you wanted to reach a large audience, you needed to be able to afford to buy a printing press or a television network or a cable outlet. And now you can, with the kinds of technology we're using to talk to one another, reach at least as many people, and in a lot of cases, even more so. And that has really frightened power centers to have lost the monopoly on information dissemination. Previously, dissidents would be confined to print magazines or tiny little corners on the internet when it first started. That's no longer the case. There's all kinds of dissent that's at least as prominent. And that is why I think when you talk about online censorship, which is one of my primary causes, not my primary one, you can really trace the systemic, industrialized attempt to implement online censorship to early 2017 as a reaction to those two traumas I identified earlier. And this battle to regain control, to commandeer the internet, is in some ways expected. Power centers traditionally don't just give up their prerogatives easily. If there's some emergent technology that threatens it, they've always tried to commandeer it or crush it. So it's not surprising. But I think we are seeing that. It's just a very, very difficult technology to try and control.
If the battle against censorship isn't your number one priority, what is?
I think it's related. I mean, certainly I have spent a great deal of time on the foreign policy dogma, the endless war posture, the growing U.S. security state power that's unaccountable and secret, both inside the United States, but also a lot of EU countries, that operates as a sort of undemocratic, unseen, and yet almost omnipotent power force embedded within our government so that we can go and vote for the people we want for parliament or Congress or prime minister or president. And in so many ways, it really doesn't make any difference if you have this hidden permanent power faction embedded within your state that knows the system way better, has a lot more tools to keep even elected officials in check. I mean, it's kind of gotten this pejorative term deep state, as though people think it was invented by a Fox News host in 2017. In reality, it's been a crucial part of left-wing scholarship for decades to understand how Western and non-Western countries work as well, even ones that are presumably democratic. So that, though, to me is related because a lot of these censorship efforts are emanating from those same agencies. So those kind of agendas have merged.
There does seem to me to be a change in the wind. You know, I watched the response, as many of us did, to the shooting, the killing of the UnitedHealthcare CEO, and you know, rather than mourning, you know, the death, there was an outpouring of rage, you know, vengeance, which felt to me like the mask of civilization slipping. You know, that civilization, that society depends upon mostly compliant and obedient citizenry going peacefully about their business. And there was something in the reaction to that killing that seemed as if there was something different. And I wondered if it was symptomatic of more and more people feeling backed into a corner, running out of options. You know, democracy feeling hollow, freedoms and rights feeling hollow, and increasingly, if people feel they have nothing left to lose, then that lays the groundwork for a potentially very volatile and dangerous situation. No,
I couldn't agree more. I think one of the most fascinating parts of that episode, and we're sort of still in the middle of it, so I think it's really worth deconstructing, is that historically, over the past, say, 50 years, you may have been able to predict the response to that based upon where somebody falls on, say, the traditional left-wing versus right-wing spectrum. The more somebody is left-wing, the more likely they're to cheer the attack on a big CEO of a huge health insurance corporation. People on the right generally would be more supportive. I don't think you saw that at all. I think, in fact, the much more predictable breach was between, and we're seeing this constantly, establishment elites on the one hand, almost all of whom expressed in rage and outrage and disgust and indignation that anybody would react to anything like this with anything other than condemnation. Liberal establishment elites, conservative establishment elites had that reaction. It was really a very organic outpouring on the part of the internet that you saw in every ideological crevice of the internet, where people's reaction was not, wow, I'm so enraged that somebody went and shot this person in cold blood. I don't think it was a particular celebration about the death of this person who nobody really knew, nobody had strong feelings about, but as a symbol of both a specific industry, the health insurance industry, that has brought so much misery and suffering to people at their worst and most vulnerable times. But more generally, this idea that we live under the boot of huge, faceless, multinational corporations that nobody can control, that don't in any way value the humanity of everybody else, who look at everybody as a piece of property to squeeze the last cent of profit from. I think that's really the sentiment. And then you can go a little more broadly to what we were just discussing about, which is this growing breach between elite society on the one hand in the West and the vast majority of ordinary people on the other. And you just look at revolutions in the last 4 or 5 centuries, or going back, if you want, even further, they're generally based on the growing perception on the part of the majority of the population that the inequality that all of these societies have become so unsustainable and so unjustifiable because it's the byproduct of extreme avarice on the part of those who have against those who don't, or indifference about the welfare of the vast majority of people by those who wield power, so that it no longer even has a pretense of concern for or any sort of justice about the inequality. And that's what starts to spark a kind of rage and a kind of almost a sort of inchoate violence that this system needs to be destroyed. And I think if you look at the politicians who have been succeeding, led by Donald Trump, but Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen and others, what they're really channeling and vesseling is that rage at a system of status quo elites who most people have come to regard not just as illegitimate, but as a system that needs to be destroyed.
To get back to that, that idea that I voiced earlier about the failure of the story and the failure of the narrative, is it in part because increasingly it's hard to believe that the powerful care about democracy? The way that they've been behaving around elections, and the way that elections have been being, or the way in which the results of elections in places like Bavaria and Thuringia in Germany, and and in France, and the way things seem to be being murkily interfered with in Romania and in Georgia, the Western story is founded on the idea of democracy. And that what the elites have done with their misbehaviour in relatively recent times is seem to show to people that the very idea of democracy is hollow. Even when people do vote and make plain what they want at the ballot box, if it doesn't suit the elite, then they will disregard it or reinterpret it to their own ends. And so more and more people, I think, are seeing that the West is, if it ever was founded upon democracy and freedom, is increasingly just about the elite and the powerful harvesting unto themselves more and more wealth and more of the control that comes with extreme wealth. And in somewhere like the Middle East, perhaps, that emptiness bumps up against, obviously there are mercenary elements in the Middle East, of course, who are motivated by money rather than ideology, but that there are still, for some considerable numbers out there, deeply held ideological beliefs, and that we've kind of unilaterally disarmed. We don't have a meaning, we don't have a point beyond the pursuit of wealth by the few.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to, there's a lot there that I think is really interesting, but just try and pick out the 2 or 3 things to which I've reacted the strongest. In a way, it gets back to what I was trying to say earlier, that sometimes we might idealize the past. So this democracy narrative that we love democracy so much, that we in the West go around combating authoritarianism and tyranny, which was the prevailing narrative during the Cold War as well. That's what justified the Cold War. The Soviet Union was autocratic and repressive and tyrannical, whereas we were devoted to freedom and democracy, not just for ourselves, but for all the people around the world that we were trying to defend. And yet, so much of the Cold War involved our going and destabilizing or uprooting democratically elected governments, which we disliked, and replacing them with authoritarian or even worse, tyrannical, savage autocrats. We have often been very close allies and partners with the most savage dictators on the planet. I thought it was so notable this week when Keir Starmer was forced to give a speech about what happened in Syria. And of course, he wanted to stand up and say, we, the British, celebrate the fall of this brutal dictator. And unfortunately for him, he happened to be on a trip to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, two close British partners, and was forced to give that speech while in those two countries, I think exposing what most people outside of the West have actually seen for quite a long time, because they've been the victim of this false narrative that you hear Western capitals talking about their love of democracy, and yet in many of their countries, democracy is destroyed and they have dictatorships imposed upon them. I think, the greater flow of information, as we've been talking about, has made people more aware of that. But I think the much bigger issue is that a lot of this has started to have been directed inward. So the same mentality that devalued democracy and that said, it doesn't matter what the outcome of elections are, we can't respect those unless we perceive it serves our interest, has started to manifest not only in places like Ukraine or Georgia or Romania, just three recent examples where we've seen election outcomes we disliked and are working to reverse simply because we don't like the outcome, but increasingly inside of our own countries as well. I mean, we had, 3 straight elections in the United States where all kinds of power centers, including ones that are supposed to be barred from interfering in our politics, like the CIA and the NSA and the FBI, directly interfered in 2016 with a false narrative about Russia and Trump, in 2020 with lies about a story that broke right before the election based on the president's son's laptop, that the CIA invented a story to justify its censorship, saying it was Russian disinformation and not reliable. It turned out to be perfectly authentic, had nothing to do with Russia. And in 2024, you saw a lot of confederations of power centers trying to manipulate the outcome of elections again. On top of that, you saw things like the Democrats trying to imprison their primary adversary, the one person they really feared could beat them, and turns out probably was the one person who could beat them, in multiple jurisdictions. And so, I've seen statements from EU officials about the importance of censoring and enacting new censorship dynamics, like the one you have in the UK with the Online Safety Act, or in the EU with the Digital Services Act, explicitly arguing the reason those are necessary is because we have a lot of upcoming elections and want to make sure that these governments maintain the ability to control the flow of information so that they can ensure the right election outcomes happen. So when we start to see democracy degraded, not just abroad the way we've always done or for a long time, but also in our own countries, combined with, I think you're absolutely right that whatever you want to say about people in the Middle East who are motivated by extremist religious ideologies, or even people in Israel who are as well, or people around the world who are devoted to some very doctrinaire left or right-wing cause, I think in the West, at the same time we've given up religion, at the same time we've given up any real fixed beliefs other than material gain, we've also atomized ourselves through computers and through all kinds of modern day conventions. So we've lost spiritual connection to society as well. And I think you're seeing this kind of emptiness, a spiritual sickness that arises from having no fixed belief other than the pursuit of material gain, which increasingly, I agree with you, is what defines the West more than anything. And I think therefore has weakened the West relative to other places in the world that have different priorities than that.